Welcome to day 2 of the lectures from Dr. Craig on the divine properties. Today we're talking about aseity.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Good to see you again. Aseity, from the Latin words ase, by itself, is God's self-existence or independence. God does not merely exist in every possible world, as great as that is. He's a necessary being. But even more greatly, he exists in every world wholly independently of anything else. Moreover, God is unique in his aseity. Other things exist apalio, through another. But in virtue of his aseity, God is, in Brian Leftow's words, the sole ultimate reality. Now, in accord with the methodology that we've adopted for our inquiry into the divine attributes, we want to begin by looking at the biblical data concerning divine aseity. The conception of God as the sole ultimate reality is firmly rooted in Scripture, church tradition, and perfect being theology. The biblical witness to God's sole ultimacy is both abundant and clear. Undoubtedly, one of the most important biblical texts, both theologically and historically in this regard, is the prologue to the Gospel of John. Speaking of the pre-incarnate Christ as the Logos, or Word, John writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being." All things, panta in the Greek, connotes all things taken severally, not simply the whole. Of course, God is implicitly exempted from inclusion in all things, since he's already been said to have been ein, in the beginning, NRK. God and the Logos are not the subject of becoming or coming into being, but of being simplicator. They simply were in the beginning. Everything other than God and the divine Logos came into being, agenito, through the Logos. The verb is the aorist form of ginomai, whose primary meaning is to become or to originate. Verse 3 thus carries the weighty metaphysical implication that there are no eternal entities apart from God. Rather, everything that exists, with the exception of God himself, is the product of temporal becoming. The verb ginomai also has the meaning to be created or to be made. This meaning emerges in verse 3 through the denomination of the agent, di autou, responsible for things coming into being. The preposition dia plus the genitive indicates the agency by means of which a result is produced. The Logos, then, is said to be the one who has created all things and brought them into being. A second, equally significant metaphysical implication of verse 3 thus emerges. Only God is self-existent. Everything else exists through another, namely through the divine Logos. God is thus the ground of being of everything else. John 1:3 is thus fraught with metaphysical significance. For taken prima facie, it tells us that God alone exists eternally and a se. It entails that there are no objects of any sort, abstract or concrete, which are co-eternal with God and uncreated by God via the Logos. Partisans of uncreated abstract objects, if they are to be biblical, must therefore maintain that the domain of John's quantifiers is restricted in some way. quantifying, for example, only over concrete objects. Now, this issue is a subtle one, easily misunderstood. The question is not, did John have in mind abstract objects when he wrote Panta diautou agenito? Probably not. But neither did he have in mind quarks, galaxies, and black holes. Yet he would take such things and countless other things, were he informed about them, to lie within the domain of his quantifiers. The question is not what John thought lay in the domain of his quantifiers. The question rather is, did John intend the domain of his quantifiers to be unrestricted once God is exempted? It's very likely that he did. For not only is God's unique status as the only eternal, uncreated being typical for Judaism, but John himself identifies the Logos as alone existing with God and being God in the beginning. Creation of everything else through the Logos then follows. The salient point here is that the unrestrictedness of the domain of the quantifiers is rooted not in the type of objects thought to be in the domain, but in one's doctrine of God as the only uncreated being. But was John, in fact, ignorant of the relation between abstract objects and divine creation when he wrote verses 1 to 3, as we've assumed? Well, it is, in fact, very far from clear that the author of John's prologue was innocent concerning abstract objects and their relation to the Logos. For as we saw yesterday, the doctrine of the divine creative Logos was widespread in Middle Platonism, and the similarities between John's Logos doctrine and that of the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo, 20 BC to AD 50, contemporaneous then with the New Testament, are numerous and striking. Of particular interest is the role of the Logos as the instrumental cause of creation. The use of dia plus the genitive to express instrumental creation is not derived from Jewish wisdom literature, but is an earmark of Middle Platonism. Indeed, so much so that scholars of this movement are wont to speak of its prepositional metaphysics, where various prepositional phrases are employed to express causal categories. Philo identifies the four Aristotelian causes by these prepositional phrases, stating that through which ta, di, hu expresses creation by the Logos. The similarities between John and Philo's doctrines of the Logos are so numerous and so close that most Johannine scholars, while not willing to affirm John's direct dependence on Philo, do recognize that the author of John's prologue shares with Philo a common intellectual tradition of Platonizing interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. Now, while John does not tarry to reflect on the role of the divine Logos causally prior to creation, this pre-creation role features prominently in Philo's Logos doctrine. As I mentioned yesterday, for Middle Platonists, the intelligible world, the cosmos noetos, served as a model for the creation of the sensible world, the cosmos oratos. But for a Jewish monotheist like Philo, the realm of the ideas does not exist independently of God, but as the contents of his mind. The intelligible world may be thought of as either the causal product of the divine mind or simply as the divine mind itself actively engaged in thought. Especially noteworthy is Philo's insistence that the world of ideas cannot exist anywhere but in the divine Logos. Just as the ideal architectural plan of a city exists only in the mind of the architect, so the ideal world exists solely in the mind of God. On Philo's doctrine, then, there is no realm of independently existing abstract objects. According to David Runya, while not part of the created realm, the cosmos noetos, though eternal and unchanging, must be considered dependent for its existence on God. Preoccupied as John is with the incarnation of the Logos, he does not linger over the pre-creatorial function of the Logos. But given the provenance of the Logos doctrine, he may well have been aware of the role of the Logos in grounding the intelligible realm, as well as his role in creating the realm of temporal concrete objects. However this may be, reflection on John 1, 1-3 leads to the conclusion that the author of the prologue of John's Gospel conceives of God as the creator of everything apart from himself. There are no uncreated, independently existing, eternal objects, for God exists uniquely a se. I then considered the Pauline witness as well, where, for example, in 1 Corinthians 8:6, Paul speaks of one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. And I think it's evident that Paul shared this same view of the Logos. The biblical witness to divine aseity and God's being the sole ultimate reality is thus impressive. God is affirmed to exist independently of everything else and to be alone eternal in his being. Everything apart from God is said to belong to the realm of temporal becoming and to have been created by God through Christ, the divine Logos. Let me ask if there is any discussion of the biblical material pertinent to divine aseity.
We'll start with online. So from Nate, why would John Platonize the interpretation of Genesis?
Well, that's asking about his motivation, which is hard to speculate about. But if we think that John believed in the deity of Jesus Christ and his incarnation, you remember in John 1:18, he says, "No one has ever seen God, the only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known." And so he thinks of Christ as somehow being fully divine, existing with the Father prior to creation, and then becoming incarnate. And the Logos doctrine of Middle Platonism fits that beautifully. It enables John to express the full and complete deity of Christ, but his personal distinctness from the Father. So although I'm speculating here, I think it's very easy to see how the Logos doctrine of Middle Platonism would appeal to John. Yes, Quincy.
So I've actually thought about this tremendously, but I think it's more of a, I would argue that it was more of a Stoic concept of the Logos, because the Stoics were the ones that claimed that the Logos was itself divine, whereas I'm not sure if the Middle Platonists do, and if they did, it was later after the Stoics, was it not?
Do I not mention some of the early Middle Platonists in this section? Maybe that was in the part on divine incorporeality, but no, these fellows like Ascalon and others lived prior to the turn of the era, although Philo was closer to New Testament times. So there wouldn't be anything anachronistic about seeing Middle Platonism here. On the contrary, I think that the Logos doctrine of Stoicism is much farther away from what we have in John and Paul, where you have an hypostasized Logos that is a personal being, and not like this Stoic notion of the Spirit, which is more like an ether that pervades space. So I think that the case for seeing Middle Platonism as a closer source for this doctrine than Stoicism is pretty convincing in my mind.
Okay, let's turn to a question online from Nick. Is there Old Testament support for aseity?
For aseity. Well, I suppose Genesis 1:1 could be appealed to here. These passages that talk about God's being the creator of everything else. And in Isaiah, where God says, I am the only everlasting being who was with me when I created the world. But I'm struck by the Johannine and Pauline witness to aseity. I think the Exodus 3:14, where Moses asked God's name and he says, I am that I am, that would be a stretch, I think. I think that what that speaks to perhaps is God's everlasting existence and faithfulness to Israel. But I think it would be a stretch to read that metaphysically as later medieval scholastics did. I think we're on firmer footing with John and with Paul. The doctrine of divine aseity confronts a serious challenge from one of the oldest and most persistent of philosophical doctrines, Platonism, which holds that in addition to concrete objects like people and planets, there also exist abstract objects like numbers and sets and propositions and properties. Platonists maintain that such objects, though abstract and usually held to exist beyond space and time, are nonetheless every bit as real as the familiar physical objects of our daily experience. They exist necessarily, for it is inconceivable that there should exist, for example, a possible world lacking in numbers or propositions, even if that world were altogether devoid of concrete objects other than God himself. Moreover, and this is the crucial point, they exist a se. There is no cause of the existence of such entities. They each exist independently of one another and of God. It is this feature of Platonism more than any other which has troubled many Christian theists. Not only is there an infinite number of such objects, there's an infinite number of natural numbers alone, but there are higher and higher orders of infinities of such objects, infinities of infinities, so that God is utterly dwarfed by their unimaginable multitude. God finds himself amidst uncreated, infinite realms of beings, which exist just as necessarily and independently as he. The dependence of physical creation upon God for its existence becomes an infinitesimal triviality in comparison with the existence of the infinitude of beings that exist independently of him. Platonism thus entails a metaphysical pluralism which is incompatible with God's being the sole ultimate reality. In the contemporary debate over Platonism, there are principally two arguments lodged against Platonism and one argument in its favor. The two objections usually urged against Platonism are the so-called epistemological objection and the uniqueness objection. The major consideration weighing in for Platonism is the so-called indispensability argument. Whether Platonists can successfully defeat the two principal objections lodged against their view may remain a moot question here. Rather, our concern is with the indispensability argument. For if the indispensability argument is sound, it will constitute a defeater of biblical theism. 3.41, then, the indispensability argument. Today, there are a variety of indispensability arguments on tap. Philosopher of mathematics Marc Balaguer nicely epitomizes such arguments as follows. 1. If a simple sentence, that is, a sentence of the form A is F or A is are related to B or whatever is literally true, then the objects that its singular terms denote exist. Likewise, if an existential sentence is literally true, then there exist objects of the relevant kinds. For example, if there is an F is true, then there exist some Fs. 2, there are literally true simple sentences containing singular terms that refer to things that could only be abstract objects. Likewise, there are literally true existential statements whose existential quantifiers range over things that could only be abstract objects. 3, therefore, abstract objects exist. Premise 1 states a meta-ontological criterion of ontological commitment. It does not tell us what exists, but it does claim to tell us what must exist if a sentence we assert is to be true. The claim is that singular terms, such as proper names and definite descriptions, and existential quantification are devices of ontological commitment. Premise 2 states that the denotations or reference of certain singular terms in literally true simple sentences, like, for example, 2 + 2 = 4, cannot plausibly be taken to be concrete objects of any kind. Premise 2 likewise states that there are literally true, existentially quantified statements involving quantification over abstract objects, like, for example, there is a prime number between 2 and 4. Given the proffered criterion of ontological commitment, anyone who asserts such truths finds himself committed to the reality of abstract objects. Now, let me ask if there are any comprehension questions about the indispensability argument before we proceed. It's important that you understand it before we go on to examine it. We're not interested now in your criticisms of it or responses to it, but is there any question about understanding what the indispensability argument asserts?
Nate says, could you further explain existential quantifiers?
Yes, I'm sure some of you must have wondered about that. In first-order logic, there are existentially quantified statements that state there is, etc., or something is, or some are. And these are statements that are purported here to carry ontological commitment. If you say there are buffalo on the Great Plains and claim that's true, then you've committed yourself to the existence of buffalo. So that's the idea of existential quantification. It is a logical formalization of informal quantifiers in the English language, like there is, there are, some, there is an object such that, and expressions of that sort. Okay, 3.42, responses to the indispensability argument. Fortunately, there is a wide range of responses open to the Christian thinker in response to Platonism's challenge. The contemporary debate over Platonism finds its epicenter in the philosophy of mathematics with respect to the ontological status of mathematical objects like numbers, sets, and so forth. Taking such objects as paradigmatic abstract objects, we may lay out some of our options as follows. And here you see figure 1, options for dealing with the challenge of Platonism to divine aseity. Looking at figure 1, we see that the various options can be classed as realist on the left, that is, mathematical objects exist, a-realist in the center, there is no fact of the matter concerning the existence of mathematical objects, or anti-realist, mathematical objects do not exist on the far right. Further, there are two brands of realism about mathematical objects on the left side of the chart. Those views which take them to be abstract objects and views which consider them to be concrete objects. Of realist views which consider mathematical objects to be abstract, there is, in addition to Platonism, a sort of modified Platonism called absolute creationism, which holds that mathematical objects have, like concrete objects, been created by God. Concretist versions of realism, on the other hand, are anti-Platonist views which take mathematical objects to be either physical objects or mental objects, the latter either in human minds or in God's mind. The most promising concretist view is some sort of divine conceptualism, the heir to the view of the Church Fathers. Now, in between realism and anti-realism about mathematical objects is a-realism, the view that there just is no fact of the matter about the reality of mathematical objects. The classic version of a-realism was the conventionalism of Rudolf Carnap, who held that talk of mathematical objects makes sense only within a conventionally adopted linguistic framework. Although conventionalism was motivated by a now defunct verificationism, there are nonetheless contemporary philosophers who are not conventionalists, but nonetheless embrace ontological a-realism, according to which certain ontological questions like, does the number 2 exist, just have no objective answers. When we turn to anti-realist options on the right-hand side of the chart, we find a cornucopia of different views. Neutralism holds that the use of singular terms in existential quantification is neutral, so that we are not ontologically committed to the existence of numbers by asserting obvious truths like 2 is less than 3. Free logic, on the other hand, takes existential quantification to be ontologically committing, but denies that the use of singular terms is a device of ontological commitment. Neo-Meinongianism denies that existential or particular quantification is ontologically committing, though it affirms that there are objects referred to by abstract singular terms like 2, but with the caveat that these objects are non-existent. Fictionalism holds that the use of singular terms in existential quantification is ontologically committing to the objects referred to or quantified over, but denies that mathematical statements like 2 plus 2 equals 4 are true. Ultima facie strategies hold that mathematical discourse may be taken as true without ontological commitment because it can be either taken figuratively or paraphrased so as to avoid reference to or quantification over abstract mathematical objects. Pretense theory considers mathematical discourse to be a species of make-believe, prescribed to be imagined true, so that mathematical objects are no more real than fictional characters, and so on. Now, of these options, only absolute creationism looks on the indispensability argument with insouciance. For the absolute creationist affirms that mathematical objects are abstract objects, existing in some sense apart from God, though causally dependent upon him. Accordingly, this option has appealed to some Christian theists as the best way to safeguard divine aseity. Unfortunately, absolute creationism appears to involve a vicious circularity, which has come to be known as the bootstrapping objection. The problem can be simply stated with respect to the creation of properties. In order to create properties, God must already possess properties. For example, to create the property being powerful, God must already possess the property of being powerful, which involves a vicious circularity. The only plausible way to avoid the bootstrapping problem, it seems, is to affirm that God can be powerful without having the property of being powerful. But such a solution removes any motivation for realism about properties. Now, I proceed to discuss other possible means of escape from the bootstrapping objection, but I'm going to skip over those to look at the alternatives to Platonism and the indispensability argument. But before we proceed, is there any comment on absolute creationism?
God had eternally created properties.
If he what?
If he had eternally created properties,
Yes.
right?
Right.
Wouldn't that get around the bootstrapping?
I don't think so, Dave. Obviously, they are thinking here that these properties as abstract objects, numbers and things, would be eternally, perhaps timelessly created even. But the circularity that is alleged here is an explanatory circularity. It's not that God must be temporally prior to the creation of properties to create them, but rather that he must be explanatorily prior to the creation of properties. But in that case, explanatorily prior to creating the property of being powerful, God would already have to be powerful. If he weren't powerful, he couldn't create the property. So the vicious circularity here is an explanatory circularity, not a chronological one.
So wouldn't God's nature, like, of being powerful, wouldn't that define what powerful would be in some sort of way? Could someone do that to avoid the bootstrapping problem here as far as absolute creationism?
Well, if you mean that God can be powerful without possessing or exemplifying the property of being powerful, I personally think that's exactly right. But as I say, that completely cuts the nerve of realism, because in that case, at least God is able to be powerful, generous, loving, holy, all the rest without having any properties. And so what's realism doing? The ontological assay of the Platonist, of entities being composed of a substance and its properties, goes by the board.
Okay, I got you. So that would just do away with realism.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It would make realism otiose.
Let's take a question from online from Nate. What does Carnap mean by conventionally adopted linguistic framework? The idea that there is no fact of the matter about something seems odd to me.
It does seem very odd. I find our realism to be really strange. But for someone like Carnap, he believed that certain things like necessary truths are just conventional. You just arbitrarily adopt a certain linguistic framework. Say, the mathematical object framework. You adopt a linguistic framework in which you speak about mathematical objects. In that case, the question, are there numbers, becomes obvious. Well, of course there are. Within that conventionally adopted framework, but there is no objective truth of the matter about whether numbers exist outside that conventionally adopted framework. And for Carnap, as I say, this was motivated by his verificationism. He thought these sort of metaphysical questions outside a conventional linguistic framework were meaningless because they couldn't be verified by scientific means. Yes, Quincy.
Christian philosophers have often defeated the Euthyphro dilemma by appealing to essentialism. And couldn't we just avoid the bootstrap dilemma by doing the same and just arguing that these properties are essentially a part of God?
No, I don't think that works. That's sort of my response to Dave here a moment ago. Rather, the way the Euthyphro dilemma is defeated is that the good is neither a property that God exemplifies, nor is it something that he creates, but rather that God is the good. He is the paradigmatic good. And I think that that is right. That's an anti-Platonist solution. There you have dispensed with these abstract objects like properties and said that God, a concrete object, is the good. And similarly, I think, as I indicated to Hunter, we can say that God is powerful and holy and loving and all the rest without saying that he is so in virtue of exemplifying properties.